Well, if we could say that lightning doesn't always strike the house of a malevolent individual, but will strike the lightning rod, the science proves a great deal there. And it suggests that there are events in the natural world that may ultimately be governed by nature and nature's God. But we can see on Earth that those temporal events can be observed. We can acknowledge them. This transformation of our understanding of the world in which we live had to take place before we could make a declaration of independence to separate us from England and believe that all men are created equal and that they are endowed with their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that these can be instituted in government. We can create governments that are man-made, not made from God. In the temporal world, we govern ourselves. And this perception of the role of man has with it the idea of republican government different than monarchies and other forms of government. The Republican form of government has certain attenuated assumptions made with it, that man has certain rights amongst themselves, and these rights exist prior to the formation of any government, that governments must conform to the needs of the people rather than the people to the needs of the government. And this is a very unique idea in 1776. It follows a long train of science, it follows a long train of philosophers who write on the subjects, but the nature of man is such that he can govern himself. And if that's the case, we're creating a government then that has to conform to the people and not people conforming to the government, which the state governments in effect were asking the people to do. We sent representatives to state legislatures, we elected the governor, but even so, the majorities in those states, which are always the debilitating factors of natural rights, are never governments themselves. The debilitations of natural rights and civil rights are majorities in societies, not the governments themselves. It naturally follows that majorities may govern the government, but not necessarily. And it's this alteration of the view of man's relationship to himself, to other men, and to governments themselves that allowed us to declare the independence and then to create a government that fits that philosophy. And that's the evolution of the Constitution. It reflects the event rather than establishing a new concept of government.
So why then, if that were the case with the Constitution, why the compelling case to create a Bill of Rights that tempers to a certain degree the Constitution?
Well, it's a very good question, and it was very preeminent during the whole process. The states, as I have mentioned on several occasions, there were several states that had references to rights of the people within their respective states. 8 of the 13 states had references to these, habeas corpus being one, bills of attainder and such. But not all those 8 states were congruent in what rights they wanted to declare. But all of those were state governments. They were not necessarily Republican forms of government. They had intimations of it, but not necessarily Republican forms of government. When we create the Constitution, we're creating a Republican form of government, which has the inherent assumption that it emanates from the people to the government rather than the government to the people. So many of these rights are retained by the people even before the government is formed. When you form the government itself, in the case of our national government under the Constitution, we were creating a government without plenary powers. The states had plenary powers. They had to give up some of those powers to create the national government. The government had limited powers, and it only was able to operate in those areas defined by the Constitution. If there was no power and authority given to the national government to abuse the powers of the press, then what's the reason for declaring a right to the free press? But in the process of this discussion in 1787 with the Constitutional Convention and also with the ratification process in 87 and 88 and early 89, there were many people who objected to the Constitution because of a lack of a statement of these Bills of Rights. Mr. Jefferson himself was in France and suggested that many of the states should ratify the Constitution, but certain states should withhold their ratification until there is a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights, aside from possibly being redundant in association with a Republican form of government, it could be dangerous if people sought the enumeration of rights. The language used to enumerate each of those rights would be deficient. It would also be construed that any rights not in such a list would be
would be taken advantage of by the government.
by the government itself. And this goes on, and certainly in lots of ways. So I was opposed to Bill of Rights at the beginning.
Right.
It also, some of these demands for Bill of Rights emanated from ratifying conventions that wanted to change the proposed Constitution to include their proposed amendments. Well, if that was the case, every state that had already ratified the Constitution would have to take up the question again.
And that meant that the Constitution essentially, one of the challenges that was being faced is the Constitution was either being challenged by some of the states that didn't want that Constitution to begin with, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you had those states that actually wanted the Constitution and didn't want to amend anything in it. And so you're kind of between a rock and a hard place.
Very much.
And the Bill of Rights, I guess, came up as the instrument that could kind of wiggle its way and satisfy both parties. Is that how it?
Yes, in a very real sense, the Constitution was ratified by narrow votes in many of the ratifying conventions, but most of the objections raised were for lack of amendments. Some of those amendments, there were 200 amendments proposed by 6 of the states. These are vast amendments to the Constitution. Many of them had to deal with the structure of the government, which I did not want to touched at all. But some of them had to deal with the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights was basically a statement to the people that they possessed rights that they wanted clearly stated. In advocating for the ratification of the Constitution without a Bill of Rights, an institution had to be formed. And without that Constitution being ratified in the form in which it was presented, we would be into that discussion 30 years later about a Constitution being done at all. And so I was very much opposed to that. I was opposed to the idea of enumerating rights that were proposed because it may have an impairing effect upon the national government. It would have an even more devastating effect if it left the implication that whatever rights were not included would be left to the national government. So these objections were almost political in nature. The people opposed, the Constitution was ratified and was implemented, but many of the people did not support it because it did not have a Bill of Rights.
Interesting.
So that then put me to the table to suggest, yes, the people want a Bill of Rights. Or they want amendments, first of all. And those amendments that dealt with the structure of government and alteration of structure of government I wanted to put set aside. We wanted to include those amendments that would give general satisfaction amongst the people and persuade those who would withheld their enthusiasm to embrace the new Constitution with this new Bill of Rights. It had to be phrased in a particular way. The Congress met in March. We didn't have a quorum until April. Mr. Washington was inaugurated on the 30th of April in 1789. And in May, a few days later, May 4th, I remember in 1789, I proposed that the Congress take up the question of Bill of Rights, particularly in the House of Representatives. There are 2 ways to change the Constitution. 3/4 of the states can make application. Virginia did, New York did, and many of the states had not. And when Virginia and New York had made applications for changing the Constitution through the states, they were tabled because 3/4 of the states had not made the request. But the second way of altering the Constitution was to emanate from the Congress. And the Congress could propose these amendments and then send them to the state legislatures for their approval or non-approval. And so we opted to have the House of Representatives take up the question. I proposed it May 4th. I remember the date specifically, and June 8th, we made the proposal again. It's not until August that we really sit down in the House of Representatives to call for the open house. There are 57 members of the House at that time. And to call them into an open committee of the whole. And we discussed these things freely. The committee then would report to the same number of individuals, but as the House of Representatives, and propose amendments. After that is done, the amendments we took from 200, we limited down to 40, then down to 20, and to send them to the Senate, and the Senate limits them down to 12. And the ad hoc committee we had formed to join the House version with the Senate version met, and those are the 12 amendments that were proposed. to the several states for their ratification.
Of which 10 eventually made it into the...
The first and second did not.
Correct. There's a couple of interesting similarities here with the case in Lebanon. First is I guess the way that people within Lebanon and the communities, because we don't really have states. Communities right now have a lot more power in the sovereignty issue that we were talking about that other communities are unhappy about. And the net result has been that there is a lot of divisions within a society that the Constitution is not well built to deal with. And so you end up with complete political gridlock and a society that's unable to reform itself. We've gotten to a point at this point where the nation is in a steep downhill trend, economically, socially, from any aspect you could look at. Those that are preaching for a Bill of Rights are essentially trying to find an alternative model where you're presenting a direct link between citizen and the state without the intermediary being necessarily the community. And here there is something very interesting that in my research I found out that by strengthening the rights of a citizen through a Bill of Rights, essentially you're strengthening that citizen, but in a way you're strengthening the diversity of that citizen. You're giving them the rights to be what they want to be. And looked upon from that perspective, that also strengthens the community in ways that the community cannot reciprocate. The community cannot strengthen its individual